All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the quarterly dairy industry legal update. Today's focus topic will be federal milk marketing order reform. We have a few housekeeping details to go over before we begin. First, this webinar will be recorded, and it is being recorded. The recording will be available to view on our YouTube channel within the next few days. You will also be able to find the recording through the Watch or Listen tab on our website or on the event page for this webinar. In addition, you will be able to access today's slides on these pages by the end of the week. I'll post some of these links in the chat once we get started. For those of you interested in receiving CLE credit, we will provide 2 code words that you will need to use to receive credit. I'll post a link to the CLE form in the chat. Actually, I've done that already, but I'll do it again later as well. Click on that link and then enter your name and the 2 codes and hit submit. You will not need to enter any payment information. The center is covering costs for today's webinar. If you have any trouble with this process, please email me right away. You can email me at jks251@psu.edu, and I'll add this to the chat later as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law, I have a list here of some of the resources we offer. We have a large selection of written research materials where you can look up specific questions you may have about agricultural law. You can also find information about our past and upcoming presentations, and we're active on several social media accounts, including Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. To find these resources, check out our website at aglaw.psu.edu. If you want to know more about a specific topic, I'd recommend our agricultural law issue trackers under the Research by Topic tab. Issue trackers provide a timeline of legislative and regulatory proceedings for select topics. Pennsylvania landowners and attorneys should also consider checking out the Ag Law virtual resource rooms. These virtual resource rooms hold a compilation of statutes, regulations, and case law, and various other publications relevant to the chosen topic. For example, if you're interested in learning about case law relating to Pennsylvania's Right to Farm Act, you can find it under the Case Law tab in this virtual resource room. If you're looking for a weekly update on the latest developments in ag law, consider subscribing to the Agricultural Law Weekly Review. As one of our most popular written work products, you can find the Ag Law Weekly Review on the homepage of our website, or you can find it under the Publications tab. If you want to stay updated on the latest developments in agricultural law, but you aren't up for reading these articles, look for the Agricultural Law Podcast. The Ag Law Podcast is currently hosted by Penn State law student Audrey Thompson. Audrey posts weekly episodes where she and Brook Duer break down these new developments. This is a great way to stay up to date while you drive to work or mow the lawn or whatever. Our podcasts can be found on our website or any podcast streaming service. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher. The next webinar in our quarterly dairy legal update series will be held on Tuesday, July 27th, and the focused topic will be geographic indicators. So please keep an eye on your email and save the date in your calendar. If you're interested in being added to our mailing list, please let me know. Send me an email, send me a chat, and I'll get you added to the list. Before I start talking about our presenters, I want to give a quick thank you to our partners. We're grateful to be partnered with the National Agricultural Law Center, and this material is provided as part of that partnership and is based on work supported by the National Agricultural Library, Agricultural Research Service, U.S. Department of Ag. All right, to get started, we're going to go to Ross Pifer, Director of the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. Ross will give an overview of legal and regulatory developments in the dairy industry from the first quarter of 2021. Then we'll hand things over to Brook Duer, who will introduce Dr. Andrew Novakovic. They will give some background on federal milk marketing orders. Then the two of them will talk about developments in price and income support programs, risk management, workforce legal issues, and more. Throughout the session, feel free to post questions in the Q&A, and we will address them at the end of the session. Time permitted, we will answer these questions and open the floor to new questions. If we run out of time, please send us an email and we will get back to you as soon as possible. And that about covers it. Okay, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Ross.
Okay, Jackie, thank you. Okay. So thanks, Jackie. And so I'm going to spend the next probably about 15 minutes kind of giving a very brief kind of highlights of some of the legal developments over the last quarter. And to start off, just to mention a couple issues that we talked about last in the last quarter's webinar, and they're issues that we're continuing to follow, but no real developments that we're aware of or that are public to talk about, and that's with the USMCA dispute with Canada and Mexico. I mean, we spent a lot of time in our last webinar discussing that, and I would encourage you to take a look at that webinar if you're interested in that topic. The next point, this is the second bullet point under the Dean Foods bankruptcy. We talked about the issue of or the allegations of essentially the preference payments that were made to dairy producers immediately prior to Dean Foods filing bankruptcy, and that there had been a claim asserted for the return of those funds, and nothing new to kind of discuss in that. But I just wanted to kind of mention that we're continuing to keep an eye on that. Now, I want to talk in the rest of my time primarily about three issues. One is the Dean Foods bankruptcy, because there continue to have been developments related to that. Talk about some of the food assistance programs, and then finally talk about a handful of state measures that have been implemented over the past quarter. So with the Dean Foods bankruptcy, I guess just the approval of the plan that was accomplished by the judge last month, the Chapter 11 bankruptcy plan. Now, as far as a few specific items within the Dean Foods bankruptcy, there was an issue of obligations that Dean had, that Dean owed to for the federal milk marketing order pool obligations for the dairy checkoff program. There was an agreement reached whereby Dean's will be paying those funds, or they will be paid out of the bankruptcy estate. That those funds will be paid 90% of those funds. So that was that stipulation that was approved by the court in January of this year. Next, along with continuing with the Dean Foods bankruptcy, on the antitrust issues regarding the sale of assets to DFA. And there was a suit involving three processing facilities in North Carolina, and that suit, there has been a settlement of that suit. Now we don't have all of the details, or those details are not public at that point, but the parties have reached a settlement of that case to address those three Dean plants in North Carolina. Now, with regard to the facilities, I mean, also there was an issue that was raised with regard to facilities in the upper Midwest, as well as Massachusetts. But with the two plants in the upper Midwest, that the sale of those two plants was approved by the bankruptcy court, and that sale has moved forward. The Massachusetts plant was also part of that, but that was dropped from the settlement. So the court order approving these sales just dealt with these the two plants, the one in Wisconsin and the one in Illinois. Okay, moving to the food assistance programs. The Biden administration, or the USDA under the Biden administration, just announced kind of what they're calling the USDA trouble with getting my words out. USDA pandemic assistance for producers, and that's essentially kind of an umbrella for all of the various programs. And within that program, you'll see the dairy donation program was started, and this is kind of piggybacking or building on the milk donation reimbursement program that was established in the last Farm Bill. But you'll see if you look just at the second bullet under that item, look at that funding, seeing the increase, the amount of funding that's available in 2021 for reimbursements to processors and co-ops for donations to the charitable food system. And we also have a link here for you to get preliminary details. And I guess I should have mentioned at the outset, I'm zipping through these slides pretty quickly, and this PowerPoint has a lot of details on it, and the PowerPoint really is meant for you, is meant to be a reference for you to get more details or to provide links where you can get the primary resources. So you'll see that all of these, all of the links that are all of the blue underlined content is linked. And so we will be posting these on our website that you can access to so that you can get that further information, or if you want these before we get them posted, just shoot us an email and we'll forward this the PowerPoint to you. Okay, so that's the dairy donation program. Now to just highlight a few state measures, two from Pennsylvania and one from California. There's been an issue over the last several years about deduction, and I guess take a step back. Pennsylvania has a system where dairy producers are paid an over order premium. So it's just as the name suggests, it's a premium that's on top of the federal order, and it's paid to producers for milk that's produced, processed, and sold in Pennsylvania. And for milk that's produced by cooperative members, that payment is paid to the co-op. And there has been an issue for several years for a desire to have more information mandated that cooperatives have to provide to their members. And there have been legislative proposals, and then just recently it was accomplished through regulation by the Pennsylvania Milk Marketing Board that co-ops, I mean, once this gets through the regulatory approval process, co-ops will be required to provide a line item on the monthly statement that indicates the amount of that overorder premium to provide for or there's a desire to provide for transparency to the cooperative members. So this was it was promulgated by the agency. Then, in accordance with the administrative process in Pennsylvania, was delivered to the legislative committees and was approved by the IRRC, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, and so it's well on its way for final approval. And then, as the last sentence in this paragraph indicates, it will become effective 120 days after it is published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Okay, moving to California, the California Department of Food and Agriculture issued an order that requesting that there's going to be a producer referendum on the continuation of the state quota system. So obviously there's been a lot of focus on California with the implementation of the or the establishment of the federal milk marketing order, and and now shortly thereafter, now they're considering eliminating the quota program that's been in place for a long time. And you'll see here there's a link to a resource that can provide you a lot of background on California's quota system. And now moving back to Pennsylvania, the Milk Marketing Board had been providing a service where they would do bulk milk tank calibrations, and that's being phased out. So it's being phased out for cooperative members within the next month, and then by the end of this year, it will be completely phased out. Okay, so I have about 2 minutes left here that I want to run through some additional materials. And again, you can access these resources more fully from the PowerPoint. But we have some additional resources on federal milk marketing reforms. Also, some links to the National Dairy Farm Program with its year in review was published about 2 months ago. And I want to just spend a little bit of time on this American Farm Bureau Federation report. It really gives a tremendous amount of information on dairy data and statistics over the last decade. I'm just going to run through quickly a few graphs that indicate information about cow numbers, dairy production. Here you can see a 10-year change in the in production, which really is interesting to look at this on a state-by-state level. And then we have again, kind of following along the annual data, and here we have year-over-year data on individual operations in each state. Again, very interesting information here. Just to close with a couple additional items. One, dealing with international trade, and just to highlight the bullet point in the update, the fact that USDA just recently announced that it will be very shortly in the future implementing an electronic system to complete a lot of the forms for the export. And then finally, this NAS organic study was released, and we didn't get a chance to talk about this in the last quarterly update, so we've included this again. But here's an excerpt of data which is interesting to look at this at a state-by-state level, just to see where Pennsylvania places and where some other states place as well in terms of organic production. I guess I said finally, but finally for real now, just at the end of the prior quarter, the dietary guidelines were released, and that obviously always has an impact on the dairy industry as well. So with that, I am right up my schedule, so I'll turn it back to you, Jackie.
Okay, great. I'll just jump in here real quick. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, so the second code word, we're gonna give that out now. The second code word is marketing. So attorneys who are interested in receiving a CLA credit for this webinar, please add this code word to the form when you submit it at the end of the session. Again, the second code word is marketing. If you have any problems accessing the CLA form, please send me a message through the chat, or you can send me an email anytime. All right, now I'm going to turn things over to staff attorney Brook Duer and Dr. Novakovic.
Good afternoon, everybody. I really want to thank all of the out-of-state guests that we have. We did a little more promotion for this quarterly webinar to some targeted areas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, and we got some results from that. So I'm very happy that we have so many people joining us from outside the region. And I think our guest, Dr. Novakovic, who probably needs no introduction to most of you, is a big reason why we have all of these people coming from other jurisdictions. So thank you, Dr. Novakovic, for being the draw here. You sold some tickets for us, apparently. I have here a link on this screen to his CV. I'm not going to go over in detail. Obviously, Dr. Novakovic has a long history, 30 plus years with Cornell, if I'm not mistaken. Is that's and now you're retired? Is that correct, Andy?
Yeah, after 42 years, I'm now retired, which apparently involves a paycheck more than actually doing work.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So that's the kind of retirement we all want. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about, and I did not plan this way. I did not pick federal milk marketing order reform to be the topic now because I knew there were all these developments brewing. This kind of happened almost coincidentally, but certainly there's probably no hotter topic right now in the, at least in the dairy webinar world, than federal milk marketing order reform. And I've attended a few of those myself in recent days. This one is one of my own design here, and it may be a little bit different. I'm going to try to keep the topics limited because if you take this topic on, you're liable to get stuck in the mud just by the sheer size of it. So the recent petition that was filed by, or that I shouldn't say, the recent vote of the board of National Milk Producers Federation to file a petition sort of ordered the presentation. So I'm going to really concentrate in a lot of ways on the things that National Milk says it's going to be pursuing in this petition. In order to do that, I want to do a little setup, which means I'm very attuned to the idea that once you start talking about, federal milk marketing orders in any degree, you get a certain amount of people whose eyes start to glaze over after a few minutes. I'm going to try to avoid that. I don't know if it is avoidable, but I'll do the best that I can. And bear with me. Maybe this presentation, this way of presenting this works. I'm trying to be attuned to keeping it simple and understandable. Now, it went the wrong way. Okay. By the way, I would say that if you really want to dig into the subject matter, required reading is this publication from Dr. Novakovic and Mark Stevenson from Wisconsin that was part of, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, this Dairy Markets and Policy, that's a product of the University of Wisconsin, correct? Or is that independent?
That's actually a multi-university group that I started at Cornell, but it represents our joint work, yes.
All right. So I have to say hats off to you for this because I have not found something that is more easily understood than this, and particularly easily understood on exactly what we're facing right now, particularly with the negative PPDs. So that this document I just think is invaluable to getting a clear understanding of what's going on. And it's worth reading over and over again because I think the clarity is just so well. It's just an excellent document for understanding what's going on, and particularly right now. Now, just to lay a little bit of foundation here, I'm going to apologize in advance for my extreme oversimplification and any misstatements here. We have some dignitaries in our audience here. We do look at the registration list, and I'm quite impressed by who has signed up. So hopefully we make it worth your while. I like to start, and this is, I picked this up from a couple other educational opportunities that I've had, is I like to start by laying some sort of a foundation that you can follow along once we delve into the discussion with Dr. Novakovic. So bear with me. We will get to him in a moment, but I'm going to go over some slides that hopefully set the stage for the discussion of particularly the negative PPDs that we're seeing right now, but other issues also. And I think that it's nice to start a discussion of federal milk marketing orders just by saying, okay, what's the objective of this thing? And really, it's the objective. I learned that my limited as it may be knowledge of dairy pricing, I learned by exposure to Pennsylvania's state system first, but it has the features that have the same objective, which is spread the benefit of the higher class 1 fluid milk revenues across as many producers as possible. So I think that that's a succinct way to say, this is what this entire system is about. Everything else, to some degree, is there to serve that objective. So, we all know the basic setup, which is class one, brings in higher revenue generally. We have to, of course, qualify that in this world. But, and the idea of the entire system is simply to spread that wealth around. And really, it's nice to keep your eye on the ball, perhaps, and not get lost in the minutia. Now, the method for doing that is this market-wide mandatory pooling of class one revenues, as well as optional class 2 and 3 revenues, if they're eligible to be included into this mandatory market-wide pool. And it's all done through a monthly system of setting an advanced minimum price and then truing it up at the end after the month is concluded. Now, tons and tons of complexity in there, but I find it helpful to just boil it down to that you've basically got a situation of establishing this pool. You give an advanced price, at least for the class one, and then you wait until the month's over, or the system waits until the month's over, and then it trues it all up to actually establish the final prices for that month and to distribute what would be in that pool. Now, to some degree, I think of it as a theoretical pool rather than an actual pool, and I think that's correct. The objective, once again, is so that the participating producers in there that are included in the pool, and that's a big qualification, get some type of a uniform price that spreads the wealth around, that spreads the class one revenue around. Andy, do you have any beef with the way I've described the objective and the really, really, really oversimplified methodology there? Did I get that, askew in any way?
No, I might just add a wee bit. As you've alluded to, there is an element of the federal price regulation that is forward-looking, and there's an element of the regulation that's backward-looking. And it is this characteristic that primarily explains the phenomenon of negative producer price differentials. And so it's basically the products that we choose to put a higher burden of price on, mostly class one, although a little bit for class two, we say, oh my gosh, if we're going to ask these people who are buying that milk to pay a higher price, we should give them an advance notice. We should give them a heads up. So if we're going to impose this price in May, we should let them know sometime in April so they can work this into their pricing, talk to their customers, know it's coming down the line. For the other part of the milk supply, which is class 3 cheese and class 4 butter and non-fat dry milk, we do that after the fact. So the May price for those products, we don't know what that's going to be until June. And it's this inconsistency in the timing of these prices that will end up being a huge part of the story about producer price differentials.
Okay, great. Yeah, good point. And my limited ability to express these concepts means I go, simple. You got better skill at than adding the extra qualification. But I think it helps when you're trying to teach this subject to just boil it down to some of these really basic principles. Okay, now there we go. Okay, so this is somewhat famous at this point in time in terms of a diagram of how the pricing system works. I found it confounding, but also informative as time went on, and I understood it more, and I read up more, and I started to really be able to work with it and understand all the boxes and arrows. Andy, explain who Blimling and Associates is, and how did they come to prepare this particular chart? Do you know the story behind that?
Yeah, Blimling and Associates is a company that provides placement services for people that want to do transactions on futures markets, broker. They also provide market commentary and consultation for people that are looking for planning and business planning or general market outlook. In fact, they have an office in Pennsylvania with a fellow that has worked in Pennsylvania for many years, actually has a farm in Pennsylvania. So they're one of these dispersed sort of companies.
Right.
And of course, USDA AMS is the agency that's responsible for administering marketing orders. So Blimling is using their resources and creating this graphic.
And if you've ever used, for our attendees here, if you've ever, tried to get a way to teach yourself the pricing system as it presently exists, I think this is the way to do it, I have to say. Now, one thing I think we're going to mention in a later slide, this is the pricing system since 2000. Prior to that, we're not going to address, but this is the commodity and component type system that has been in place since 2000 at least. And this is the system that people talk about trying to reform in one way or another. Now, just for people's understanding who are not particularly schooled on the issues that we're here to discuss, and I understand we have an audience that is, many of you are very schooled, I like to focus in on just looking at in the establishment of the various classes, which, or the pricing for the various classes, going to this third column, let's say, we begin to see some instructive sort of lessons to be learned here, which is all in the current component pricing, all of the various classes are priced. The price is determined by various information and data that's coming from the components. But class one doesn't have that. As you see, no arrows going into class one. Class one simply comes from class three and class four. And as we continue to drill down with the negative producer price differentials, this becomes so relevant to understanding how it all comes about. So we see that class one is entirely dependent on the class three and class four price for its setting of the price or the price determination. Now, let me go forward, and I'm probably going to end up coming back to this slide. Maybe I should do one thing, which is, okay, just for the internal logic of this, and again, we'll start with the third column from the left and move over to the right. We won't talk about the component portions quite yet, or at this point. Hold on, sorry, I have a tendency to do this. As we see, the pool is made up of the revenues derived from each of these classes' sales, and then the pool, essentially this truing up process at the conclusion of a month. Maybe I'm misstating that or not putting the right spin on that, but the bottom line is the as designed operation should be that class one is putting more money into this pool, and that excess money that should be coming from class one sales ends up getting distributed in a uniform blend price to the producers, essentially, out the right side of this little diagram. Now, we all know that there's been many market forces that have decreased the class one contributions into the pool, one of which is just a general cultural, societal, and historical fact that we as a culture are consuming less class one. So over time, we've always had this creeping line on a graph with this creeping decrease in the contributions from this arrow into the market-wide pool from class one revenue. However, as designed, and that, there still is always a general assumption that you're going to have, sorry about that, you're going to have excess revenue generated by class one sales that will enable this uniform price to be established at, something that is let's just say, something that is tolerable. Now, due to the pandemic, in addition to just general decline of class 1 consumption, we have this pandemic-induced distortion of the system that essentially has intensified this attention that something is wrong with the system and that the system is broken. The various components, again, we talked about this dating back to the year 2000, and then we had a change in May of 2010, which was made in the calculation of the class 1 price right here that is, that is determined by, that is determined by the class 3 price and the class 4 price. The tweak was made to that particular calculation at the point where I was showing you on that chart, pursuant to the 2018 Farm Bill. And that has obviously loomed large also. And Andy, I'll give you a chance. I just wanted to lay a little bit of foundation so we didn't lose people, or maybe they have a little bit of ability to hold on and follow you when we start moving forward. So why are we here to talk now? Because that tweak that was made in 2019 has produced these unanticipated negative numbers, these negative producer price differentials that are, instead of the class 1 sales producing, or I should say all sales within the pool, producing enough money here that there is an excess that in the truing up process, you come up with a livable producer price, we end up having what is essentially a deduction, a negative number coming about as a result of that calculation that is established for the establishment of the class 1 price. Now, Andy, this is the somewhat famous chart that the American Farm Bureau Federation put together that covers June to November. And I really wasn't able to find a chart of similar nature that carried us through from November to the present day. Generally, have we been looking at similar numbers in the last, whatever we have, 5 to 6 months? Or give us, what have we been seeing in the last 5 to 6 months?
There continue to be episodes of negative PTDs, but not of this magnitude.
Okay. So, and I think somebody, Marvin Bayshore, a friend here in Pennsylvania, explained it to me as, that, or said, it's particularly aggravating to producers because it's looked at as a deduction, whereas it's really just this truing up process of this big pool of revenue that you've generated. So let me go on to our next. Okay, so that has now produced, that last graphic that we saw has now basically produced here these several months later with a continuation of that, those types of class 1 pricing, essentially suffering deductions as a result of market conditions that exist now. We have a petition that has now been approved to be filed by National Milk Producers Federation. And Andy, tell me the genesis of the phrase or the terminology class 1 mover. What exactly, why did that word come into being? Because I think that confuses people right there.
Well, let me just step back a little bit to make sure we're all on the same foundation on this.
Okay.
One is the federal government in the 1930s accepted a responsibility, if you will, to establish a minimum price that farmers should get paid for milk. That right from the get-go begs a question, by what criteria do I determine this minimum? Should this be something that guarantees everybody a profit? Should it be based on some sort of cost of production thing? What's the rule for how I pick this minimum? And without getting too bogged down in the details, the what evolved partly by legislative instruction and partly by how the regulation was framed is to say we want to try to mimic supply and demand, both sides of the marketplace, not just focus on what we think farmers deserve, but also pay attention to what can consumers afford. Remember, this was done in the 1930s. So sure, there was a big ag issue, but there was also a consumer issue. And so throughout its history, the determination of prices has been related to some way of assessing what is a reasonable, fair market value for milk in any given month that reflects both supply and demand conditions. The particular indicators that were used have varied over time. Early on, not all the milk was priced under federal orders, and you could easily look at prices in other areas that were unregulated and say, oh, maybe this is telling me something about market values. What we came to realize in the 1990s before this reform is there just wasn't hardly any unregulated milk left that would provide us some sort of a template for, what a starting point for what milk is worth. And so we thought about a variety of alternatives, but ultimately decided, okay, we can't really get at this by looking at a competitive, unregulated value for milk. But how about if we go downstream to wholesale level markets and see what's going on there? Because nobody's saying this has to be the minimum price for cheese or the minimum price for butter or what have you. That then says, okay, this gives me some notion about what these basic uses of milk are worth. How do I translate that to a price of milk? And the concept there was, well, we know how much milk it takes to produce a pound of cheese or a pound of butter or a pound of whatever. And we can make an estimate of what that conversion cost is. So, because obviously those processors have to cover their cost. So basically, we're now asking the question, if a cheesemaker gets $1.50 for a pound of cheese, what can he afford to pay a dairy farmer? If a butter maker gets $1.83 for a pound of butter, what can she afford to pay a dairy farmer? And of course, doing that calculation is, a little bit complex, but it's not really. It's basically trying to provide this insight into what can I afford to pay. The other thing to keep track of here is that we ask buyers to pay a certain price, call them class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, based on characteristics of their market. If I'm a cheesemaker, I'm going to pay a price that's consistent with what I'm earning as a cheesemaker. If I'm in the butter business, likewise. We impose a price on class 1. We say, this is what we think you should pay. And the question becomes, okay, where does that number come from? We don't survey prices in grocery stores and say, this is what you're getting when you sell to your customer, and we'll subtract some kind of make allowance, and that's what you can afford. Instead, we say, if this is what the cheese and butter guys are paying, we think you should pay more. This is what Brook was saying about pooling that class 1 value. We're saying you're in a business that has customers who are less sensitive to higher prices. This is not to say they're insensitive or they don't care, but we have observed over 100 years that higher prices on beverage milk consumption doesn't penalize sales as much as higher prices on cheese consumption. And so we say, okay, we're going to build up from this platform to create a slightly higher price, or a higher price, however you want to describe it, slightly or larger, for this class 1 milk. And so you've got 4 different prices out there for 4 different buyers. And then the question becomes, what do you pay a farmer? If he sells to class 1, do you give him the class 1 price? If he sells to butter, do you give him the butter price? Well, that doesn't hardly seem fair, because one guy's going to get a great price and one guy's going to get a crummy price. And that's where this idea of pooling comes in, to pay what is nothing more than a weighted average price for all of these four classes, weighted by the volumes of milk that go into each of those. And it's this pooling, this sort of a disconnection between what my plant that I deliver to is paying for milk and what I ultimately receive for milk that ends up giving us this phenomenon of a producer price differential. We decided in federal order reform prior to its implementation in 2000 that systems that reward higher protein content were virtuous, that this was a good thing, that it resulted in a higher quality milk supply. And we wanted to reward farmers for that. But we also realized that if I'm a butter maker, having higher protein milk doesn't really give me a tangible economic benefit. If I'm a fluid milk processor, sure, we want customers to know that there's protein in milk and that it's healthy for you. But having a higher protein content doesn't increase my yield of fluid milk. It doesn't increase my ability to charge a price. So he said, okay, we're not going to burden you with paying for higher protein prices or paying for higher protein content, but we're going to pay every farmer based on protein. We're not going to try to get any more complicated on the farm level. And herein lies the difficulty. If you pay every farmer based on protein value, fat value, and everything else that's left, which is mostly carbohydrate, you're essentially paying them a class 3 price. And so the question you ask at the end of the month is, I've got a bucket full of money, that's called the pool, and I have to pay farmers something. I want to start out with the class 3 price. Let's assume we pay them the class 3 price, and we pull that money out of the bucket and say, here's the amount of money I need to pay the class 3 price. In a normal marketing situation, and certainly the kind that we expected would occur all the time when we design the system, we'd assume there would be some money left in the bucket. And so we'd say, okay, fine. We'll just take that money that's left in the bucket, divide it by the pounds of milk, and add it in. That's kind of sort of metaphorically this extra class 1 value. And that would be a positive addition to the class 3 price, the so-called producer price differential. What we now discovered, which was certainly theoretically in our sights, but we didn't really imagine it would become such a big deal, is that if we start with the class 3 price as what we're going to pay farmers, sometimes there isn't enough money in the bucket to pay everybody the class 3 price. And so we have to say, oops, sorry, we don't have that much money, so I have to take some money back. It becomes a negative producer price differential. Well, at the end of the day, the money you had to pay for milk was the money in the bucket. It isn't like there was actually like a deduction, because that class 3 price was too big. It was, my first guess was too big. And so the negative producer price differential, I think, is found to be offensive by a lot of dairy farmers, because it feels like you're taking money away from them. And the reality is that money was never there in the first place. That money was never in the bucket to begin with. And in a very literal way, what it means is that the weighted average price of all the classes of milk was a smaller number than the class 3 price. And the difference between those two is this negative producer price differential. So on the one hand, you can look at it and say, it's just an accounting thing because I guessed wrong on the blend price can't be the class 3 price. And on the other hand, it just feels like I'm being penalized. And a lot of producers are finding that offensive. The last thing I'll say, Brook, is the other part of this that gets into the conversation is, if you are buying milk to be used for drinking purposes, class 1 milk, you are subject to the regulation. There is no choice. There is no, I don't want to be, that's just it, you're in. If you are doing anything else, you have to prove that you should be in. You have to, it isn't just like, yes, sign me up. You actually have to do something to prove that you should be in. Sometimes this something is not so hard. Sometimes it's actually kind of hard. And so the flip side of that coin is if you say, I want to be out, that's also not so hard to do. Again, how hard it is depends on where you are, but that's called depooling. That's saying, no, thank you. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And so the second aspect of negative PPDs that folks are finding troublesome is some people that would be obliged to pay this high class 3 price that's higher than the blend price, essentially means they're going to give some of their money to another processor, just the way the class 1 guys give some of their money to another processor to enable everyone to pay the same uniform blend price. That's called pool equalization, something that is the bedrock of the issue in the Pennsylvania overorder premium. It's basically sharing money that was generated by class 1 sales to people who didn't produce milk for class 1 markets. And this depooling, this saying, thank you very much, I don't want to do it this month, means that there's a bunch of milk that gets out of the pool and is not contributing to prices for folks that they're not associated with. And so these two things, this accounting issue of the negative PPD and the depooling become the issues that are of concern. This existed well before the pandemic, but it just got way over exacerbated during the pandemic, and probably in no small part because the Farmers to Food Box program, which was hinted at earlier, which the Biden administration is discontinuing.
And in terms of that class 3 price, since we're talking about that, being this, over exuberant, what's the word that the Federal Reserve likes to say, irrational exuberance, is the value of class 3 that is being used and driving so much of this, is that real? I mean, is the class 3 price accurately reflecting, or is it accurately reflecting what the market is is bearing in the sales of class 3 product?
Well, my short answer is yes, but the logic of the system is say, I want to establish a minimum price for milk. What can I look at? What measures can I look at that are not tainted by my regulation, that are just reflecting market values? And so the question is the price of cheese that we use a fair reflection of market values? Is the price of butter that we use a fair reflection of market values, et cetera? USDA collects these prices from processors that make and sell these products as commodities. So we don't care about people who are selling brie. We don't care about people that are selling 10-year-old cheddar cheese. We look at people that are selling fresh commodity cheddar type cheese. And we say, okay, what's the price that you sold this product at? And back away, what can you afford to pay from that calculation? The part that gets tricky is, suppose you have a government program that somehow does something to impact the demand for that fresh commodity cheddar cheese. Mm-hmm. That's a real effect. That's in some ways a market effect. It's genuine in reflecting supply and demand, but it's also true that that particular demand, that government-enabled demand, is not normal in the sense that going to a grocery store and deciding what to buy is normal, or going to the pizza parlor and deciding what to buy is normal. It's a little unusual, and that's a big part of why we saw all the drama in 2020 was we had these rather significant large pulses of unusual and somewhat unpredictable demand for the stuff that was going in the dairy boxes and the cheese requirement in particular.
Okay, so let's go. Unfortunately, I never budget my time well, but let's go to the petition, and I'm going to go to my next slide here. Okay, so the National Milks petition is to modify the Class 1 mover that produces the negative PPDs, and essentially adjusting it every 2 years, so creating a mechanism for adjusting it every 24 months. And it says, with the current mover remaining the floor. So are you reading that to mean that they want the current definition and the current calculation to stay in place for 2 more years as is, and then have it revisited?
I'm pretty sure what that means is we're going to recalculate the 74 cents every 2 years, except it can never be less than 74 cents. Okay.
All right. And so we'll cut right to the chase here. And they're not talking about changing the higher of, changing the average of back to higher of.
No.
They want to keep it as average of for this foreseeable future. Does that sound like that's how you're reading this?
Yes, and the first paragraph in this slide, I think, is really important to pay attention to, because when we chose the higher of, cooperatives representing dairy farmers were basically saying, we want to give our farmers the best deal possible. So we need to have the class 1 is going to be a number bigger than the lower classes. But when you've got 4 classes and 2 of them are commodity classes, what do you pick? And some folks may remember there was a point before 2000 when we only had 3, and the 3rd class was the low one. So it was real simple. You only had one choice. In some orders, you only had 2 classes, and then it was really simple. When you added, when you broke the commodity classes into 2, a 3, and a 4, you had to say, okay, what is my base? What is I'm adding? And so the brainstorm was, well, just pick whichever number is bigger and add your class 1 premium on top of that bigger one. That is the most friendly thing you could do. What we discovered is that this made it a little bit more challenging to use futures markets to hedge a farm price, or for that matter, if you were a class 1 buyer, if you wanted to hedge as a buyer, because you never knew which one it was that was going to be the effective price. And so in taking the average up, you could use the class 3 futures and the class 4 futures prices together and come up with a more sensible, more logical hedging strategy going forward. So now when we're thinking about making an adjustment, a lot of people would like to preserve this ability to more easily use futures markets for a hedge, but to avoid or reduce this issue of negative PPDs. And so we like the idea of the averaging because of what it does for futures, but we want to fiddle around with the 74 cents.
Okay, let's do this. We are at 1 o'clock. I would ask those attendees who are able, and Dr. Novakovic, if you are available, I'd like to continue and do some Q&A after I do a little bit of housekeeping here. Are you able to stay on a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, for our attendees, please bear with us. We will try to continue on for as long as Dr. Novakovic has the ability. Really sorry that we burned through so much time. Just to let our attendees know what else is in the PowerPoint and that we had hoped to get to is I had set up some information with regard to the way that the price 1 mover used to work versus the change that was made, and then we were going to talk about some other common areas of reform. Obviously, these topics take a lot of time, as we have just seen. Let's ask the $64,000 question before we go to Q&A, because I'm sure we must have some people, some attendees that want to talk to you. With the cessation or the termination of the Farmers to Family Food Box program, yeah, I think that's the right name. And what other things have to happen for the the negative PPDs to essentially reverse themselves and come back to something more normal?
So first of all, I want to be clear that we had negative PPDs before 2020. So I would say that the conditions of 2020 exacerbated that issue, but it certainly didn't create it. And what does create the possibility for a negative PPD is when the class 3 price in particular skyrockets within a period of a month. Now remember, we don't know what that class 3 price is going to be applied to milk until after the month happens. We don't know what the April value of class 3 milk is until May. Why? Because we have to survey plants and say, what did you pay for cheese? Well, you can't ask them what they paid for cheese until they actually completed paying for cheese. So we do that pretty quickly, but by the end of April, maybe early May, we'll have that number. But with the class 1 milk, we say, oh my goodness, you folks we're going to make you pay a higher price. So we're going to give you advance notice. And it's this timing issue that creates the possibility that you could have the class 3 price skyrocket in 1 month, which means in that month where it's skyrocketing, the class 1 value is based on the last month where it wasn't skyrocketing.
Right.
And so they get misaligned. From a farmer perspective, you can say, oh, I don't like negative PPDs. And you say, great, we're going to keep the class 3 price from skyrocketing. That'll be your solution. If that price starts to really go through the roof, we'll suppress it so you don't get as high a price. And it's like, well, okay, wait a minute. No, I kind of like the higher price.
Right.
So you kind of have to temper the annoying fact that you might have this inability to pay a blend price that's as high as class 3 with the fact that the good news was the class 3 price was really big. And ultimately, over time, that's going to get reflected in the values of class 1 and class 2. It's just going to be down the road.
Yeah.
So this problem only exists when something else is happening that most farmers wouldn't say is a problem. In other words, high prices.
Right.
And we can see that happening without food donations. But that particular form of food donation exacerbated the issue.
Okay. One last question, and then anybody has questions in our attendees, I think we'll try to do a raise your hand thing here on, and you can go ahead and we'll open your mic and you can just ask the question or type them in the Q&A. Okay, let's go right to, I love to wrestle with depooling. Is making pooling mandatory for all classes of milk a solution, or what will it accomplish and what won't it accomplish?
Well, I think in many ways the question of depooling is more in the domain of equity than it is of economics. You can debate the fairness of it. You could say it should be, and you can make that determination based on any kind of a variety of criteria. The economics is that from a market-wide standpoint, depooling had a relatively modest effect on what I was able to receive as a farmer for the price of milk. For the company that did the depooling, it had a more significant event. But for the actual market-wide farmer effect, it was an issue, but a relatively small issue. The bigger issue was the actual negative PPD. So we need to kind of separate out your sense of fairness from your sense of the actual monetary issue there. The other thing is, if you ask USDA to tell you what is the mission of federal milk marketing orders, they will focus on delivering class 1 milk, delivering farmer milk to class 1 markets. And they see milk going to cheese and butter and everything else as ancillary, not my problem.
Yeah, okay.
So when you look at the question of depooling, you have to ask yourself, do you believe in this historic mission that this is really about only class one markets? Or do you say, hey, you know, it's a system for everybody. This should be for everybody. That makes more sense to me than, and so, you know, you could debate the merits of that as well.
And that's very interesting. I never looked at it in terms of, you know, now that we live in this world where class one sales are not what they once were and probably never will be what they once were, that mission statement, as you were saying it, you know, as USDA says it, becomes antiquated and not, you know, now it's no, our mission should be that all classes are generating the maximum amount of revenue so that a uniform price can be as high as possible in the pool. Doesn't that sound like the right mission then?
Well, again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I think our folks at USDA would also say, this is out of my pay grade. You're now talking about a legislative issue, not a regulatory issue.
Okay.
And, you know, they would have certainly a case to be made for that, and which would mean it could be done, but you need to talk to the other branch of government to do it.
Right. Do we have anybody, attendees, who want to ask Dr. Novakovic a question? I'm trying
Brooke,
to.
there's a question in the chat.
Okay, yeah, and I'm looking at that. Sherry Bunting asked a question here. I'll just read it because I'm digesting it while I'm reading it.
Yeah, and then there's one in the Q&A and then one in the chat as well.
Okay. Oh, that's a good point. I got to look where the chat is. Okay, thank you. This is a question from Sherry. Isn't the primary objective of federal milk marketing orders to ensure adequate supply of milk moves to class one, related to what you just discussed, and therefore the class one price was called a mover. That's good because I never do that, and was vetted in 2000 to be based on higher of class 3 or 4, not average plus.
Well, I think you have to look at the effect and ask yourself, do we see any problem with getting enough milk into class one markets? And I know where Sherry is coming from on this, but I think, you know, setting aside all of that and just saying, is there a problem with getting milk to class one handlers? Is there, you know, are they complaining that it's hard to get milk or whatever? Mm-hmm. You'd have a hard time saying that there's any difficulty in getting a supply of milk to class one that meets their requirements and needs. In fact, with class one declining, the problem is really in the opposite direction. We could get a lot more there if they would just take it. So I think what Sherry's comment really gets to is a little bit more along the lines of what's fair and reasonable to producers. The idea of the original National Milk Proposal, which was also endorsed by the International Dairy Foods Association that represents fluid milk and other processors, was that it would all come out in the wash. That 1 month it might be this and 1 month it might be that, but over time it would be neutral. And what we found out is, boy, maybe not so much when you have price movements that you never, ever expected would occur.
Yeah. Okay, question from Jane Seabright, Center for Dairy Excellence. Minnesota milk producers just came out with a proposal that would tie the class 1 mover to the class 3 milk price instead of the average of class 3 and class 4. How would that impact a market like PA when we are largely class 1 and class 4? And she says, I think it was just announced today.
Yeah. So I don't think it would be a particular effect for Northeastern markets. And remember, you're referring to Pennsylvania, but it's part of the Northeast order. So all the other states are involved as well. Class 4 would still be class 4. Class 2 would still be driven by essentially class 4 values. So class 2 and 4 are unaffected by this proposal. Class 3 is unaffected by this proposal. So you got 3 classes of milk that are going to be priced the same way they always were. The only question is, what will we see happening with class 1? And the only way that I could see the Minnesota milk producers proposal being viewed as kind of a surprise is on those occasions when the class 4 price was actually higher than the class 3 price. When we designed the four-class system, we didn't anticipate that that would occur, although we had to admit that theoretically it could. But if we look back over the last 21 years, it's actually occurred with some frequency. And so the Minnesota proposal would basically say Class 4 no longer has any impact on Class 1. And so in those time periods when Class 4 is really driving, when it's really a higher price than Class 3, you would lose that under the Minnesota proposal, whereas you wouldn't lose it under the National Milk proposal.
Yeah, okay, all right. So what's your thought on the best recommendation to either A, be prepared again for the type of market conditions that we are just perhaps rising out of? Maybe I should just stop it right there. What would be your thought on the best way to address, in a debriefing? Okay, we just suffered through, a year of these negative PPDs. We need to do X. What would that be?
Well, I'm always a little reluctant to impose my idea of best,
yes.
and clearly not all farmers can agree on what is best. But I think one of the fundamental challenges is, do I believe that it's the government's responsibility to suppress volatility, or do I believe that you can't, that volatility is just going to happen? So what government can do for me is make it easier for me to live with volatility. Mm-hmm. And under the old price support program, historically a dimming memory, we were very much in the business of suppressing volatility. Under the new environment, when we start talking about tools like dairy revenue protection, when we talk about dairy margin coverage, we are now in the business of trying to say volatility is going to happen. Let me just see if I can help you with it. And I think that what's key about these proposals is that they're really trying to maintain my ability to establish a forward price using tools like futures contracts or dairy RP, to some extent dairy margin coverage, and just saying I can't help with volatility. When we come to the table with the mindset of suppressing volatility, we're going to find these proposals to be a little bit disappointing because they won't do that.
Okay. All right.
Brooke, I saw that Sherry Bunting had raised her hand.
Okay. Let's see if we know how to deal with this. Sherry, you still there? And if you are,
Sherry, I think you should be able to talk now.
There you go.
Okay, yeah, I kind of did that by accident. So I did have a question though earlier about the effect on risk management tools for producers. I've heard from many producers in the Northeast as well as other parts of the country that even whether they use DRP, whether they hedged, even if they used a combination of 3 and 4 in some cases, or did it by components, that they had extra costs involved with the risk management, but it failed to perform as designed, in part because of the change in Class 1 contributing to the negative PPD. So what, you mentioned the Class 3 idea, tying it to Class 3, would that help producers manage risk? Because what we see is processors can now manage risk in the fluid market, but producers kind of lost some of that ability, or at least it appears that way.
Yeah, well, and I don't think it's all that straightforward for the Class 1 guys who, to my knowledge, don't really utilize risk management tools all that much anyway. But I think tying it to Class 3 probably would be just that much simpler. You'd have to get over the fact that when Class 4 is high, you kind of lost out on that. But this is in the domain, I think, of what futures markets people call basis risk, and which is essentially what is the predictability of this tool that I'm using to run my hedge and what I'm actually trying to protect. Is that a consistent relationship? It doesn't matter if it's plus or minus as long as it's consistent. And as you know very well from other commodities that farmers deal with, the basis is a tricky proposition. And you start doing 3 plus 4 and divide by 2 and add 75. That just makes all of that a little bit more complicated and confusing. And I think that's the reason why folks don't quite feel it's maybe just exactly ready for prime time. I think the Minnesota proposal would be make it a little bit more straightforward, but it's still not going to be for the faint of heart.
How about, well, we still have some people hanging in there. Sherry, did you have something else while you're on?
Well, I had earlier submitted a question just wondering if producers have any legal recourse, being that the Farm Bill language mentioned that it could be amended after the first 2 years, which is like now. And of course, National Milk is petitioning for a hearing. What other legal recourse do producers have if they say, let's just say, want to go back to the vetted hire of that was vetted as a method and then look forward to the next Farm Bill for a long-term solution where all parties can have maybe a better opportunity to manage risk?
Yeah, so not to be pedantic, but we've got 3 branches of government, right? And the guys on this call are pretty fond of the judicial branch, but I don't see any role for the judicial branch in this one. This is not going to be an interpretation of the law. So the question is, do we want to lobby Congress to amend the bill and say, to make a legislative change that requires a return to the higher up? I mean, that's theoretically possible, but quite honestly, I think that's pretty unlikely in no small part because the man who was the big champion for dairy lost his seat in Minnesota. And I don't see anybody else trying to figure out how you could bring in this tiny little thing into some larger discussion. I mean, you're going to put it onto a $2 trillion infrastructure bill or something. I mean, that scenario is hard to imagine. So then that brings you into the executive domain, which is where National Milk has positioned their proposal. Let's go to the tried and true administrative hearing method. And as you know, anybody can come in and say, I'd like to go back to the higher of. That's certainly permitted, but there is nothing like a guarantee that USDA would say, yeah, you're right, that's the best way.
So previous vetting or previous decision making where they talked about average of back in 2000 and in part mentioned depuling and negative PPDs at that time, that wouldn't have any bearing. I mean, I guess for me, it's like, would there be a simple, quick, easy way to kind of revert and start looking forward to a good, way of doing this in the future?
Yeah, well, simple and easy aren't words that we normally associate with federal milk marketing orders, so right. Probably not that way. But, I certainly would not at all prejudge what USDA might determine. But anybody who wanted to advance a proposal to return to the system of the higher of certainly could refer to the reasons that led to that in the first place. And, USDA didn't go to this 74-cent thing because they decided it was better. They were told they had to by Congress. So it's not inconceivable that they might say, well, actually, we sort of like our original idea better than the one you came up with. But they would also be listening to other proposals. National Milk has got a proposal, Minnesota has got a proposal, and I'm sure we're not done with hearing proposals if we go through an administrative hearing process.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Dr. Novakovic, is there a lesson to be learned from this, congressional intervention or meddling or, whatever we want to say happened, in the 2018 Farm Bill with this change? What's the lesson to be learned out of just the process there?
Well, I think there are a lot of folks that would say good legislation is legislation that does what I want, which is a wonderful world to live in if you always get what you want, I suppose. But I think the premise of our system, and you lawyers can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, is that legislation deals with kind of higher altitude issues. It creates a framework. It talks about what are the goals, what are we trying to accomplish, and it invariably walks back and says, that's it. You're going to have to go to the executive branch for the details. That's why you have regulation, which is a different thing from legislation. And it's basically Congress saying, we think we know where we're going to aim the arrow, but you guys need to get it in the bullseye, and we're not going to, really pester you too much about that. That's your job. Yeah. And when you start doing things like inserting class one differentials in the 1986 legislation that gave us the dairy termination program, and you start inserting the average of plus 74 cents into 2018 legislation, that's getting pretty granular. That's really doing what regulation normally does. It was successful in having the proponents get what they wanted, but now here we are a few years later cleaning up.
And I was just wondering what would have happened had that legislation not said that that a referendum wasn't needed. In other words, if this change had been made and then a referendum vote had to occur on it, I guess there's a lot of dynamics to that, but the idea that Congress would indicate that there won't be a referendum vote on this change that we're telling you to make seems to make it seems to aggravate it even worse. Although I don't know what the outcome would have been had that not been there.
Yeah, well, in 1986, we imposed those class one differentials, and they weren't frozen in time. We said, USDA can review these at a later date, but for now, they got to go in. In the 1990s, USDA was instructed to have a hearing to achieve certain objectives, some of them pretty granular, like 10 to 14 orders, some of them a little more broad, like simplification. And that was more along the lines of saying, you got to do something, but we're not going to script too tightly what it is you have to do. One could imagine using either one of those models, and the one that we got the average concept from was that older 1986 version. But Congress has in the past said, you will have a hearing, but we're not going to tell you what the exact outcome is going to be.
Yeah, okay. We didn't talk about this a little bit, and then maybe this will be my last one, unless anyone else who's hanging in there wants to ask a question. Now's your chance. Is there a tweak or an examination or a debriefing and a lesson to be learned from this that deals with those timing issues of when you announce the advance price and the administration of the price determinations for the different classes that has is there a different timing that would improve the problem for the future?
There are a number of people who have made proposals along those lines, and as we've discussed already, what gives rise to this negative PPD is in very much the fact that the timing of class one versus class three is different. So you could say, well, why don't we do it all backwards? So I don't know what the April price is going to be for anything, class one or anything, until May.
Right.
Okay. I mean, who's to say you couldn't do that? But it really would put the class one guys at a bit of a challenge, because they just sold a whole bunch of milk.
Right.
And if they found out that their price was a lot higher, their input price was a lot higher than they expected, that could be tough. And so I'm sure they would complain, and they'd wonder, how can we make this work? Or you could say, well, let's do an advance. Let's just say, okay, it's April. I'm going to tell you right now what you're going to pay for class three milk in May. Well, obviously that situation now completely reverses, and now you got a cheese guy that's saying, okay, you're telling me I have to pay this price, but I can't guarantee that I'm going to be able to sell it profitably based on demand conditions in May. So, these are sort of like theoretical solutions to put them all advance or all backwards, but they would impose some real market challenges on either the fluid guy or the class 3, class 4 guys, depending on which way you picked it.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, having taken another half hour of your time, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Novakovic, for doing this for us. And apologize for maybe I got us off to a bad start and took up too much time. But I'm glad that, you know, we got a chance to get down to the nitty gritty. I think I learned also that trying to unpack this and teach this the way that I thought I would go into it probably didn't work. You know, it ends up always being a discussion amongst those who already know enough about it to converse about it, and the rest of the crowd, you know, looks on in astonishment and befuddlement. So, and with that said, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I hope it wasn't too much of an imposition. Thank you to everybody who hung in there with us, and hope that you learned something here. And we're going to sign off for now. July 27 is our next webinar on dairy issues. And again, we're going to talk about geographical indicators at that time. We don't have our guests lined up yet, but we will work on that and let people know. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.